All right. I think we've got most people in now, so I'm going to get started. And for any of you who have not been part of these webinars this year so far, this is actually our final tender writing workshop for Skilling Queenslanders for Work for this year and for this round of Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And these webinars, these workshops that we have been doing with the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training, are something that we've been doing with them for quite a few years now, which has been a great opportunity for QCOS to foster some of that sector capacity around tender writing. And sector capacity is what I'm all about. My name is Stacey and I work at QCOS in the sector capacity team. And really most of my job is around assisting the community services sector to do their job really well. And gaining funding is one of those things that the sector must do to survive, really. So this is a great way for us to be able to hone in on some of those skills. Now, as far as how today this webinar will operate, if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. If you would prefer, you're welcome to take yourself off mute and to ask your question. When you're not speaking, we will ask that you remain on mute just so we try and not get any of those background noises. Most of you are probably quite used to Zoom by now, and you'll know that if you're speaking, the screen will go to you. So yeah, any questions, best off popping them in the chat, and I'll check that fairly regularly as we go along. All right. Now, I had a little person making their internet debut yesterday via my camera. So if it's okay with you, I know it's not what I would usually do, but I am going to turn my camera off for the majority of the presentation. Now that you've been able to put a face to a voice and a name, just to mitigate any kind of distraction happening in the background. Okay. Now, before we get into the content, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm coming today. Now, in our West End office, I would be acknowledging the Yugara and Turrbal people, and of course, I do extend my acknowledgement to them. It's their land on which I work most of the time and do lots of good work with my colleagues. I would like to extend my acknowledgement to the Turrbal people in central Queensland, on whose land I was born and raised, and the Yugambeh people, on whose land I'm coming from to you from today, and on whose land I raise my own family. And I would like to acknowledge their continuing connection to the land and the sea. So as I said, my name is Stacey. I'm from the sector capacity team here at QCOS, the Queensland Council of Social Service. Now, Skilling Queenslanders for Work is the context which we're going to draw on today for these tender writing skills. Although you will be able to see that the skills that we're talking about today are really broadly applicable across lots of tender writing opportunities that you will come across in your roles. And Skilling Queenslanders for Work relies heavily, if you have been involved in SKU before, on community partnerships. So these workshops are often a place where people will find other organisations or people to chat to about their ideas, and even sometimes someone from their own region, which can kick off a great partnership. And partnerships are the foundation on which SKU is really built. So I would love it if you could share your name, your organisation, or who you're representing in the chat, including any kind of grant writing experience and your hopes for this workshop. Would love to hear from you in the chat. It's always good, especially when we're doing things online and we don't have the opportunity to see each other face to face in a room, to kind of, I guess, get that community feel back again by knowing who it is that we're meeting with in this online space. And the purpose for today's workshop is really to help you put your best case forward to improve your chances of success with your funding applications. And our content today is focused on providing tips for community-based organisations specifically to write great tender or applications. And as I have said, the context we're using today is Skilling Queenslanders for Work. Now, you may have already submitted a funding application for the previous rounds of Skilling Queenslanders for Work, or you might be planning to submit an application for the current round. But either way, we hope that the workshop today will assist you in preparing and editing your application and making sure it meets the mark. These tips and resources will also help you with other funding applications in general. And these tips have been put together in consultation with the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training based on their feedback from previous funding rounds for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And they're based on our own experiences here at QCOS of reviewing and preparing funding applications across the community service sector, because we, like you, are often putting together funding applications as well. Now, when we talked to the assessors from the department, they said they often receive applications for really great project ideas, but the applications may have not been completed correctly, or the benefits aren't clear. And there's just some mistakes with, I guess, the writing and the finessing and putting the application itself together. And there are some common errors and omissions that come up quite frequently with Skilling Queenslanders for Work. So what we're hoping to do today is to help you avoid those mistakes and to help you clearly articulate your ideas so that when the assessors are looking at your application, they're able to, your fantastic idea really comes to fruition. So, as I have said, please feel free to ask questions using the chat function, and we'll have a look at those regularly. Now, I'm going to do that right now because I'm sure that a few of you have introduced yourself. Wonderful. Thanks, Gail. I think you were on the line yesterday, weren't you, Gail? Hi, Belinda. I think you were also here. Hello. And yes, Belinda's keeping her camera off for the same reason. It's a bit of a juggle, isn't it? Having kids at home, but we're all doing the best we can. Sandra, regarding recording this session, yes, we are recording this session. Pre-lockdown, the idea was that given this was our very last tender writing workshop, that this would be the one that we could record because it would be, it would probably be our most finessed and well-practiced one. So our intention was to record it and put it on the website. Obviously, with lockdown, things have turned out a little differently to what we had planned, but we are still planning on putting a recording up on the website. And the other thing to note, and thank you for asking this question because I forgot to say this, we will send you a post-event email after the workshop today with the slides and quite a few of the resources that we refer to today. So please don't feel like you need to be scrambling, writing all of the notes that you see on the screen. Obviously, feel free to write notes as you wish, but if you don't feel like you need to copy down everything that's on the screen, because we will send out these slides to you. Okay, Neera, you're having a bit of problem with... Okay, great. Yes, totally understand if you've got cameras off. That's absolutely fine. Oh, I just saw that Maria has answered that question about recording. Thanks, Maria. Hi, Marnie from Playgroup Queensland. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got aged care here as well. Great. Okay. So generally people here are looking for tips and tricks for writing their tender application, which is perfect. You're in the right place. And most of you from the community sector, community-based sector. So I'm sure you'll make a few connections in the chat, and we may even have some time to share some ideas. So thank you very much for all of you for introducing yourselves. It's really nice to be able to see who's here, even though I can't see you in the flesh. So thanks very much for that. I find that useful anyway. All right, let's get on to the next slide. All right. All right, so a brief session outline. We're going through a little bit of a background to Skilling Queenslanders for Work. I'm not going to go into lots of detail about Skilling Queenslanders for Work because this workshop is really predominantly around the writing of applications. However, we have run 2 Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work webinars, and we have recorded them, and we will be putting them on the website. So if you do want to know more about the intricacies of Skilling Queenslanders for Work as an initiative itself, you will be able to access that. But as I will mention during this webinar, the DESBIT regional officers really encourage anyone putting an application through for this funding to give them a call to discuss your idea with them. That's their preference, to be able to chat to you before you go through all of the effort to put a funding application together. We're going to have a look at a methodology for applying for funding and turning an idea into a funding application, crafting responses to the assessment criteria, and we will use Skilling Queenslanders for Work as our specific example with this one. And at the end, we're going to briefly go over understanding your obligations regarding the Human Rights Act and National Child Safe Principles. And I'll cover why we need to do that at the end too. Okay, so what is Skilling Queenslanders for Work? It's an annual investment of $80 million to support up to 15,000 Queenslanders into work each year. It represents a commitment to increasing workforce participation, driving job growth, and strengthening the performance of the Queensland economy. It improves skill development and work opportunities for disadvantaged Queenslanders. It relies on well-formed partnerships between community-based organisations and local employers to determine local skills and entry-level industry and labour needs. It includes 8 different programs, all with slightly different focuses and eligibility requirements. So there are some updates. If you've applied for this funding before, there are some updates this year. We've got a new target, used to be supporting 10,000 Queenslanders. This year we're looking at 15,000 Queenslanders. And there is an extra program that's been added. Actually, I believe it's 2 different programs have been added and one was taken. So definitely check all of them out if you haven't already looked through them and you would like to apply for this funding. So who has submitted a SKU application before? Would you like to pop in the chat if you have applied for this funding before? I'm just opening the chat now so I can see. We've got a broad spectrum of here, people who write applications and some people who have never submitted an application. If you have submitted one of these applications before, I would love for you to share in the chat what your key learning has been in submitting a Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And I'm going to leverage from the responses that we've had in the past in this part of the workshop, where the key learning that's most frequently shared with the group is starting early. Anything that relies on working collaboratively with other people will nearly always take you longer than what you originally predict. And partnership and collaboration really are the cornerstones of Skilling Queenslanders for Work. It's a must. You must be able to show the partnerships you have with other organisations and what all parties are willing to contribute to the project needs to be clear in the application. So it requires everyone being on the same page quite early on in the process. So starting early is one of the key messages I would put forward for this part here. So what is the funder looking for in responses? When you're submitting any funding application, it's important to first understand the objectives of the funder and what they are looking for. So if we use Skilling Queenslanders for Work as an example, what is the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training looking for in funding applications? This is directly from DESBIT. They say, community-based organisations who approach projects with the intent to provide genuine support and assistance to participants. They're looking for organisations who understand the target cohort and their barriers to employment and who can provide the support to help them develop the skills they need to gain employment in their local regions. In 2021, this is going to require really careful consideration of how the landscape and support needs have changed since COVID. Now, examples, when I say things have changed since COVID, not only have we changed a little with our target cohort, so the kinds of people looking for jobs, we also have some things have changed as far as what kind of wraparound support we can offer people. Some service provision has gone online. Can you fit as many people in your training or meeting room as you did last time you offered this program? These are just a few of the things to consider that might have changed if you have previously put together an idea for this program. For any application you write, you must be really clear on the intent of the funder and ensure your idea fits the brief. So for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, applications must demonstrate that a community-based organisation understands the intent of the Skilling Queenslanders for Work programs, which are developing the skills of disadvantaged Queenslanders, that is people who are underutilised or underemployed in the labour market, as well as building the skills of people in the target groups, providing assistance to individuals who need support to enter and stay in the workforce. Training and assessment strategies must support the needs of disadvantaged learners, and community-based organisations must have legitimate and established employer engagement strategies in place. So one clear point that the department has made to us is that training for training's sake is not acceptable. So the project really needs to be driven by the community-based organisation based on their understanding of their clients and not driven by registered training organisations or RTOs. So for any funding that you're looking at applying for, really understanding what the funder is looking for is absolutely key. So for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, it's essential that your applications provide evidence that you understand your cohort and clients, you understand their barriers and what resources they need to overcome them. You can provide the assistance they need to gain employment, or you have partnered with people who can provide the assistance they need. You know where and how you can recruit participants, and you have links to employers who can provide jobs in your local community. Providing the evidence that links with the funder's intentions is crucial for any grant or funding application. So as we go through the presentation today, we'll give you some tips on how you can do this. So our first real advice here is to use a methodical approach to winning tenders. We'll talk you through an 8-step process of preparing, planning for and writing a solid application. And these steps can apply to any funding or tender process. So this is what our tender methodology looks like. And again, you will get a copy of these slides. So our first band here that we're going to look at more closely is this red band up the top. Our recommendation is that you start mapping out your tender plan before you even start writing your response. And you might think that that's a lot of work, or you don't have time to work through all of these steps. But by applying this methodical approach, I'm getting real tongue twisted over that. You're likely to be able to build a strong case and put forward a really good proposal. So by the time you get to step 6, you should have a really clear idea about what you want to include in your proposal, and the writing part will be quite easy. If you think back to your school or university days or your student days, I remember teachers really recommending, or professors really recommending, the writing of drafts. And I would often be like, oh, writing a draft is such a lot of work when it's not even the assessment you're going to be submitting. But for any time I did actually take their advice and map out that draft, the writing part of it was so much smoother. And I think the same can be said for any writing activities, really, including funding applications. It's the planning that goes into it really puts a scaffold around the whole piece of writing, and it makes the writing itself much clearer, and it means you're not wasting time crafting words that you're going to have to cut out anyway because they're not really fit for the purpose of the application itself. So putting lots of thought into things before you write really helps things along as you go. Okay, so we're going to look at this first one here. The first part of the process is to create a grants reference library, map out your project idea, and foster strong working relationships. So let's get into these into some more detail. Okay, so grants reference library. For those who've written grant applications before, you may have found yourself scrambling for information like your financial statements or insurance details 5 minutes before the tender is due to close. I have had that experience, I don't recommend it. It's very stressful. And this is why we recommend the first step in your grants toolkit is to put together a grants reference library. It's one place where you keep all of the information you might need for funding applications. And that way you have one point of truth. And if, for example, your accountant's on holidays, you're not stuck because no one else knows where the latest financial statements are held. So you can also include in here a library of ideas that you might want funding for in the future. So if any opportunity comes up, you've got some ideas ready to go. Here are some things that you might include in that grants reference library. Audited financial statements, insurance details, your ABN, proof of not-for-profit status. Most grants these days, most funding does require resumes of key staff. They want to know who's going to actually be delivering the program. A brief description of your organisation. If you're an organisation that's large enough to have a website, you might have a summary of your organisation on your website. Up-to-date evidence of your organisation's success and capability, including evaluations and any positive feedback. So great to keep a copy of final reports of other programs that you've delivered in that library. And a copy of past grant applications, along with any feedback that you've received alongside them. Obviously, putting together applications takes quite a bit of energy and resources across an organisation. So being able to have a look at previous ones can be a great help. Mapping out your project idea. Now we've got a resource that we're going to share in the chat. It's called Grant on a Page, and it's got prompters on it to map out your project ideas, and we'll work through what you could include in the sections throughout this webinar. As you're talking, if you are at a computer where you're able to open it up, you might want to even start jotting down or typing in ideas into the template that we share with you. A screenshot of it's on the next slide, so I'll show you what it looks like. And the resource is really designed to help you describe, analyze, and design your project model. So when it comes to writing your application and answering the assessment criteria, you have a really clear idea of what to include. And it's really a good idea. This is what it looks like here. It's a great idea to go through this with any partners who are working on any funding application that you are applying for. It means that you have the opportunity to have a discussion about all of the key elements of your project idea. So you're all on the same page. Doing an activity like this can really highlight that some stakeholders have quite a different idea about what the idea is. So mapping it out like this really helps everyone get on the same page. It's really important to consider whether a project or funding fits with your organisation's mission. If it's not a good fit, you may not be the best org to deliver this project. Now, this can be a really tricky thing to consider because receiving income for a community-based organisation is for any organisation is obviously quite important. And so sometimes when funding comes up, it can be really hard to accept the fact that it's probably not the best funding for you. But we know that taking on programs or funding that doesn't really fit with your organization is a bit of a nightmare in the end. So I really encourage you to consider quite seriously with any funding that you're looking at, whether or not it fits with your organization's mission. This is a key tip from a Skilling Queenslanders for Work assessor, and they say think about who you work with on a daily basis and develop projects to support your own clients. You know your core business well, and you, I am sure, do a fantastic job of it. So leverage from what you already know. If you were applying for SKU and someone reading your application can answer these questions, then you are on track. This is what you should be including in your project summary. These are these key elements that an assessor, when reading the project summary, will be able to get a very comprehensive picture of what it is that you want to deliver. And remember, when writing any funding application, it's not all about you. So the department or funder doesn't want to know everything your organisation has ever done and everything about you. really what they want to know is how you can help them meet their objectives and what outcomes you're going to deliver that align with what they're offering, the funding that they're offering. And tender writing really is about writing clearly and succinctly about how you will meet the objectives of the initiative. So step 3 in this first band of the methodology is build strong working relationships. Start early, be proactive, share ideas, and talk to the funder. So as I mentioned early in the workshop, the department really encourages all applicants to give them a call and chat to them about your idea, because every region is different. The work priorities in every region is different. What they've seen work or not work can be different in different regions. So have a chat to them. It won't take too long, and will give you a really good indication about whether or not they think your idea is worth pursuing. Or a couple of things to consider that you might not have heard. Oh, they have great tips, especially those who have been around for a while. They've seen lots of SKU projects come and go. So I'm sure they'll have some good advice on what's worth pursuing and what considerations you might not have had yet to consider. Really important, particularly for Skilling Queenslanders for work, to talk to your registered training organisation before you submit your SKU application. You need to explain in your application how you selected them and what your working relationship really looks like. So it's important to have a relationship with them already. You're given that they're delivering the training or education side of the Skilling Queenslanders for Work project. It's really crucial that you have a good working relationship with them. So start early in your relationships. So I would recommend after this workshop having a look at that grant on a page resource and jotting down who your key partners in your idea will be. And it can be for SKU or it could be for any other funding that you're looking at. Now, we're getting ready. Now we're set. The middle band in this methodology is match project to a grant or a program and create a team and a timeline. So this really goes back to what I was saying before around ensuring that your funding or your grant that you're looking at applying for really matches your project idea and your organization's mission and the way that you operate. Look, if you're participating in this workshop, it's likely that you have identified SKU as your funding opportunity, but there are many other sources for finding grants, and these are just some of the places that you can find different grants and income opportunities. And we will be putting all of these hyperlinks in your post-event email, so you'll have access to them. As tempting as it can be when you see an opportunity come up and you need funding, don't waste your resources applying for a grant if it doesn't fit. If your project idea doesn't fit the criteria that the tender has, make sure you find grants that fit your idea, not the other way around. If you're applying for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, remember there are 8 programs to choose from. So talk to the regional representative from the department about your project idea, and they will give you some direction on what program is most appropriate for you. They know the ins and outs of the programs. So you might have a particular project idea, but not know exactly which program you should be applying for. They will be able to help you out with that. And of course, when we're getting to this stage, we're assessing the requirements. So you found a income opportunity, you found a grant or a tender, and you have a project idea. And it's at this stage, once you're looking at the requirements, you're considering whether or not you want to proceed. Do you meet the criteria? Talk to the funder if you can, and make a decision, an educated decision about whether or not this is something that is suitable for your organisation to be applying for. And for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, there's a number up on the screen that you can call. There's an email address if you would prefer to email, or if you visit the Skilling Queenslanders for Work webpage, you can find their regional offices there. Really important right at the beginning before you put any pen to paper is reading the guidelines for the funding. For Skilling Queenslanders for Work, you can find the guidelines for each program on the website, which contain information on the objectives of the program, the eligibility criteria for the participants, the expected outcomes and KPIs, and how the applications will be assessed, and the assessment criteria. And most funders, particularly if you're applying for funding from government, will have all of these very similar documents tied to any funding that they're offering. And it can be a bit overwhelming to go through all the information when you're pushed for time, but it's really the only way, excuse me, to get a clear and full picture of what's required. These are all clues to what you need to comply with to prepare a successful application. So very important to go through all of those documents. For Skilling Queenslanders for Work, applications will only be accepted via the application portal. So if you are looking to apply for SKU, make sure you've registered and are familiar with what's in the portal well before the deadline, which is 5 p.m. on Thursday, the 19th of August. Okay. So with all the information you've gathered, it's time to make a go, no-go decision. This is where you need to make a strategic decision about whether or not to go ahead with the application. Are you eligible? Does it align with your strategic goals and values or not? Sometimes it won't, and obviously that can be frustrating. But it's always good to know that you haven't wasted a lot of effort putting forward a proposal that doesn't meet the requirement. So going through all of this right at the beginning is always best. Sometimes you'll find that the outcomes of your project are only slightly different from the outcomes being sought by the funder. And in those cases, you might want to go ahead, but make sure that you make the link to the objectives in your submission so that you show you understand their requirements and that your project can deliver on them. Other times, the gap between your objectives and the funders will be too wide to make the connection. In those cases, obviously, you need to decide if you're willing to change your project idea or proposal to be able to fit the funders' requirements. And that's a decision only you and your organisation can make. Again, it's good to run any ideas past the funder to save yourself time and disappointment later. And just beware of the mission creep. So again, that's going back to making sure your organization's strategy and mission fits with the funding opportunity. And finally, do you have enough time to apply in the funding round? You might be better to leave it for future funding rounds so that you have enough time to put together a really good application. And the good news about SKU is that's an ongoing initiative. So look, we only have one round being funded in this financial year, but there has been a commitment by the Queensland government to continue this initiative into the future. So there will be absolutely another opportunity to apply, even if you don't think you've got enough time to submit this time around. And we will be running these workshops again in February. I would say February next year, early in 2022 anyway, to prepare the sector for the next funding round. Now, here's some evidence really to go with that advice to start early. Our key message all the way along in this workshop is to start early. In a Grants in Australia report, 54% of respondents said they had started an application that they didn't end up submitting. 38% said it was because they ran out of time. And obviously, we can't promise to give you more time or resources, but we do hope by following the steps in this webinar, we can save you some time with your funding applications and help you write a better proposal every time. The survey also found that 27%, as you can see, they dropped out partway through filling out the application when they found out that the program wasn't right for them. And 16% of respondents said they dropped out after discovering they didn't meet the eligibility requirements. So it really does pay to do your research and planning before you start writing your application to make sure you can address the criteria and, of course, that you're actually eligible. The next step, creating a team and a timeline. Once you've decided you want to go ahead with the tender response, it really helps to set up a tender team and think about their roles and responsibilities. And look, I appreciate that some of you are from quite small organizations and you might think, I don't actually have a team, it's just me. I'm doing it myself. Which may be true, but you do need to think about who else might be involved, even if they're not writing it. For example, most community-based organisations will have some kind of authority for Approving applications. So does someone need to approve your application before you submit? Who has the financial statements? Who's going to be getting the letter of support and working with your partners? They're all the kinds of things that you need to consider. And it's very likely that there are other people involved in the process of submitting the application, even if they're not writing it with you. So again, I would really encourage you after the workshop or even now to jot down in your grant on a page resource who needs to be in your tender team. So people within your organisation or on the peripheral of your organisation who might need to be a part of the process. Some of the roles you might like to think about assigning include the writer, editor, proofreader, partnership broker, formatter, IT guru, or the person who approves. Even if someone's role in the submission seems really small, like the IT person who helps you with problems uploading the document, if you've got everyone on board early and include them officially in the team and everyone knows when it's due and what their part of the process is, you'll get more ownership and buy-in into the project, which can be a great support when you're one of the main writers or coordinators of the submission. It's really about having people behind you and supporting you. And of course, if everyone is aware of their role in submitting an application, even if it's a very small one, and what the due date is, obviously little issues, which are actually very big issues, which is, oh, I'm actually going to be on leave that week or whatever it may be, you know about them early on rather than on the day or in the week of when that person's already gone. So making sure anyone who is part of the process knows the due date and knows what their role is, having that clear will absolutely help you in the long run. So here are some of the identifying key tasks and dates is really important in this part of the process. So we're ensuring that we were assigning jobs to team members and we're thinking in detail about all the tasks associated with them. So if you have a look on the back or the second page, sorry, you haven't got it printed out, so it'll be the second page of the grant on a page resource, you will see a checklist there, and those things will help you out with planning back from the due date, all the little tasks associated with the bigger tasks. So we'd particularly encourage you to allocate time for tasks associated with partnering and collaborations and also any service model development, because that's the stuff that takes the longest. And not only does it take the longest, but it's the critical feature of your proposal. So it's absolutely not something that can be rushed. And it's a good idea to do this a team again, because just like with the requirements, the more people you have involved, the more likely you're to think of all of the different tasks. When you're doing this alone, it's, you can miss things. So really good to have different people involved. I would really recommend having like a kickoff meeting with all the people involved in the tender writing, where you go through that grant on a page resource and you map out the project idea, and then you look at all the tasks that might be involved in submitting the application. Now, assessing the requirements, obviously a crucial part of the process. Maria is going to pop the guidelines for the Skilling Queenslanders for work in the chat. And so we'll have a look at this as our example for the next few slides. It's a really good idea to read the guidelines for any funding you're applying for and highlight the key points you need to address and make a checklist of all the requirements you can to make sure you have all the necessary attachments, information, evidence, and so on. And then you can tick them off as you go through your submission. Okay, so your tender response checklist, this is on the second page of the grant on a page resource, as I've mentioned. Milestones, key dates, the outcome sort, the key requirements, any evidence that you might need for it, pop all of those onto your checklist. You can add them to the one that we've provided. And that is a really good way of making sure you're thorough with your tender response. And this is what it looks like. So lots of different things for you to think about. And as you go through any funding guidelines for any funding you're applying for, you can make a checklist like this. Now, really important consideration and something that often is a bit of an afterthought is the evaluation. So, how are you going to evaluate your project? It's a really important part of your planning process. Think about how you will measure success and how you will know if your project is meeting your goals. As you're writing your application, think about whether or not you can deliver what you say you will. And how are you going to measure that? Generally, what you write in your application becomes part of your KPIs and your service agreement. So make sure you're realistic about what you're saying you can deliver. It also pays to think about whether or not you need to build evaluation into your budget. That Grants in Australia survey I referenced earlier about people who didn't end up submitting their applications, that same survey found that 20% of grant seekers wished there was more funding for evaluation or that they had considered it as part of their budget right at the beginning. Evaluating your project thoroughly will give you a good set of data for future projects and funding. So it really is about not only ensuring that you're able to meet the requirements of the funding that you're being given, but it's about setting your organization up to be able to secure more funding in the future by evaluating your work really thoroughly so you have a good data set for the future. Now, a methodology, we're here at the go part now, crafting your response, collecting the evidence, and triple checking before you submit. Okay, obviously, this is the key message that we're weaving through this webinar, which is think before you write. So we've talked about the importance of developing clarity around your project, writing a grant on a page to guide your work and establishing a project team and your timeline. And now we're going to dive into developing the structure for your response. A key part of this planning and thinking process is determining the structure of the response itself. So as I have mentioned, it is the scaffold on which your fuller response is built. Every word matters, particularly when you have a short word allowance, which is the case for Skilling Queenslanders for Work. And it's the case for many funding applications these days that there will be some kind of word limit. So for anyone that's done any kind of creative writing, this is what it looks like. This is the structure for creative writing. So the first point I want to make here is you're not writing a novel. So this is not the structure we're using. And I'm not talking about the length here or the fact that you can't get creative. I'm talking about the fact that the structure is fundamentally different. Creative writing tends to introduce the detail, like we're meeting different characters and the scenes are described to us, and we're left intrigued and we're wondering what's going to happen next. And then finally, we meet some kind of climax and resolution in the story. Your tender response demands the opposite. There is no room for intrigue and working up to a point. Your reader will want to be hit with the key points straight up. You start with the key message, then you provide your supporting points and themes, and then your data or evidence, your examples. Now, by putting examples and evidence down the bottom, I'm not saying that it's less important. I'm just saying that you need to start with the key message. And then you support the foundation is the examples and the data and the evidence. It's a really good idea to do some brainstorming with colleagues first so that you know what your key messages really are. What's the most important part of your project that you want to get across to the funder? Very often we see responses that build to the point using a series of examples or steps before drawing a conclusion. But what you really want to do is the opposite. You want to put your key message first. And as I've said, evaluating your project thoroughly will give you a good set of data for future projects and funding. So it's really important to consider that. If we use Skilling Queenslanders for an example here, if you are trying to structure a response for the assessment criteria, which is servicing community industry needs, you might highlight the key areas you need to address in this criteria. In this example, you need to demonstrate that you understand the skills and labour needs of the local community and how your project will address these. This is where you need to provide evidence of local industry demand and benefit to identify local skills shortages and future employment opportunities. There are some clues here as to what the assessment committee will be looking for. So make sure you talk about how your project will link with other local initiatives and services and give evidence of your links to the local employers. And don't forget to attach your current letters of support, and I'll talk a little bit more about them soon. Mapping the writing out. I really can't recommend this enough. This is one way that you can ensure that you're giving equal weighting to different parts of your assessment criteria. So if you're mapping it out visually, it might look something like this. You can use bullet points and sub-dot points and start to build your response from there. But using the visual map can be really helpful when you need to communicate your thoughts to others. So this is for illustration purposes only. You might decide to allocate different sub-word limits. Putting the word limits alongside the headings in your draft so that you have a really good idea of how much you can say and how many examples you can use. Now, doing this really prevents you from writing so much about one thing and putting all that effort and time into writing a response that you then have to really drastically cut anyway because you've gone way over the word limit. So it's really easy to start working on a section and get carried away. And before you know it, you've got 300 words. But imagine if you did that for everything, then you've got all of these words and you're going to have to cut it drastically after putting all that time into it. And if you use all of your word limit on one part of answering the selection criteria, then you're going to have a really unbalanced answer. And if they're assessing things, for example, if you've got 3 parts of the assessment criteria you're needing to respond to, and you use 75% of your word count on addressing the first thing, and they're giving equal scoring to every element of the assessment criteria, it really limits the score you're going to be able to get for the rest of it because you've left yourself very little wriggle room as far as assessing the rest of the assessment criteria. So this is why mapping the writing out and giving word allocations to every key message that you need to get across is a really good idea to really prevent yourself from getting into that situation. So here's a writing example. Superhot has been delivering accredited early childhood education training programs since 2009. This program involved partnership and arrangements between childcare centres and registered training organisations. In 2012, we expanded our program to include cultural competency training for our Aboriginal families, as there is a large population of Aboriginal families in the region. In 2017, we added a new training program specifically targeting migrant and refugee women, as there have been a very significant increase in migrant families in the local community. Trained staff are a requirement of the Early Childhood Education and Care national regulations, and there is currently a shortage of qualified staff in Utopia. Unemployment and underemployment is significantly higher for Aboriginal and migrant women in the region, so these programs are helping to deliver employment opportunities. There is also a growing number of families moving into the area, so demand for childcare is increasing. So this is a starting point. You can see here that there's some good information, but it doesn't explicitly address each point in the assessment criteria. The key messages aren't clear and there's actually no evidence. So for example, it says there's a growing number of families moving into the area and the demand for childcare increasing. It doesn't actually say how many, like what's growing number? I mean, 5 new families could be a growing number. It doesn't really provide the evidence of clarity to give solid backing to the project idea. There's also a couple of issues here with simplifying the language and cutting and going over word limit. For example, in the second paragraph at the end, you can see it says very significant. Very significant, not really the kind of, they've got too many words there. You could get the same message across without using that many words. All right, so we're going to have a look at an edited version of this project summary. Here you can see the scaffolding. You can see where the writer has very specifically gone, okay, I need to establish local need. I need to talk about impact on community. I need to link the project to the need, and I need to make a case for local support. So they've firstly given themselves some structure, and then they've been able to allocate a word count to each section. I'm not going to read all this out, and you will get the slides, so you'll be able to read this again. But this is an example of how giving structure to your response really ensures that you respond to every part of the assessment criteria and give equal weighting to every part of the assessment criteria without going overboard, talking about one particular element and then neglecting another element. Any questions about that? I'm just going to check the chat quickly. Again, if you've got any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. Hopefully that's quite clear. Okay, how to best answer the assessment criteria. And again, while this is specific to the Skilling Queenslanders for Work programs, you'll find that many funding applications have quite similar selection or assessment criteria, particularly in the sector. They might be worded differently, but the process is the same. Understand what the criteria is asking for and make sure you address it specifically. The assessment criteria tells you what's most important to address. And it's the biggest part of your writing effort, really. Your answers will only be as good as the thinking you have done during your preparation. This is your opportunity to demonstrate that you understand the requirements, to provide the evidence, to demonstrate your capacity to deliver your project, demonstrate value for money, and to articulate your unique value proposition. The assessment criteria should, and your response to it should really reflect what's most important to the funder. Now, these criteria will be used to score and rank your proposal in relation to others. So you should be aware that sometimes different people may assess different criteria. This means it's not always a good idea to address a criteria by referencing another criteria. And this is the case for quite a few funding proposals, really, and the way that they're assessed by the funder. Sometimes they are passed around to different people to assess different parts of the funding application. So just be mindful that it might not be one person reading through your entire proposal. So having clarity in every section of the proposal is quite important. So a few tips here. Be clear about what's being asked and what needs to be included. Be clear, concise, and comprehensive. And I know being concise and comprehensive might sound a bit funny, but I'll talk to you a little bit more in a few slides. We've got some tips for that. Plan your key messages and put them at the front and provide evidence to back up your claims. Now, for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, this is what the assessment looks like. All applications will be assessed in stage 1 first, and your criteria for stage 1 is your capacity to manage. If your application does not make a case for your organisation having the capacity to manage the project, it will not progress to the next stage. So those applications that don't pass capacity to manage, the rest of it doesn't get read. If you do make a case for criteria 1 and you are deemed, your organisation is deemed as having capacity to manage what you're putting forward, you will progress to stage 2. And these are the criteria that are assessed as part of stage 2. Servicing community industry needs, strategies to assist participants, and outcomes. And then the other thing that's assessed is value for money. So let's look a little closer at capacity to manage. What's being asked here is around issues such as financial viability of the lead organisation, your structure, your governance, your risk management, your reporting framework, and what's your relationship with the nominated RTO, and importantly, what relevant experience you have in the area. So what the department really wants to know in this capacity to manage criteria is, can your organisation deliver what you say you're going to deliver? And so these screenshots are directly from the guidelines that Maria posted in the chat, that PDF that was posted in the chat. And you can see that in every criteria, in the left-hand column, is the documentation that you will need to attach as part of your application. So for capacity to manage, the documentation you must submit is audited income expenditure statements for the past 2 years, and staff resumes or background information and relevant position descriptions. So the key personnel who is actually going to be coordinating this program. Gail's asked a question, which is how often are funding rounds released? So previously for Skilling Queenslanders for Work, there's 2 funding rounds in every financial year. This year, 21 to 22, is a little different, and that's just because of budget release and a few other things going on. So there is actually only 1 funding round in this financial year. So this one that's ending, or the submissions are closing on the 19th of August. Another funding round will open in early 2022, but the financial, so your organisation will not be receiving money for that until the next financial year. So applications might be opening early next year, but it won't be reconciled until that 22 to 23 financial year. I hope that's clear. After that, Desbert has let us know that after this year, this is going to be just the one kind of different year where there's only going to be one round. After that, we're going to go back to 2 rounds every year. So hopefully that's clear. So yes, you might need to wait a little while for the next round, but if you haven't started the process yet, it does give you the silver lining, I guess, is that it gives you quite a bit of time to put some thinking behind your idea and create those partnerships that you need. This is what the portal looks like. So this is a screenshot of the portal, which you would need to create if you're applying for this specific funding. And as you can see there, it's got your character limit. So it doesn't let you submit any more than what is allowed as far as word limit, or actually in this case, it's character limit, not word limit. So you need to be quite careful with what you put forward. There is no capacity for submitting more characters than what's allowed in the portal. And then you can see there, so you're putting your bulk of your writing there in that box, and then you're attaching your documents as part of your evidence after that. So that's what it looks like if you haven't seen the portal previously. So in summary, for capacity to manage, what's being asked is about your financial viability, reporting, governance, risk management, and your experience. Basically, can your organisation deliver what you're going to say you're going to deliver? And what you need to address in your writing is a summary of your organisation, your track record, your staff experience, your experience in dealing with the identified cohort, your understanding of the cohort's barriers to employment, and how you're going to reach your cohort, and any other training that might be relevant. Criteria 2. So if you do make a good case for your capacity to manage, you'll move on to criteria 2. And when you're responding to this, it's all about servicing community and industry needs. And in the right-hand column, again, you'll see the documentation that you will need to gather for this part of the application is your letters of support from local employers and industry groups. Your letters of support need to be relevant to the project, and that's a really important differentiation to make. Letters of support for this funding are not about just supporting your organisation. They must specifically support your project idea. So these letters of support from local employers and other community organisations or businesses in your local community who you have approached to support your project idea must say more than, this is a great organisation, we've worked with them before, they do great work. That's nice, but it doesn't meet the requirements. What it must say is, this organisation's project idea to do this, this and this, we support it. There is a need in our community for this qualification that they're proposing to deliver. Should we be in the position to be employing people at the end of the program, we would consider it. So they need to be quite specific. The funder needs to see that the people, organisations and employers around you, your community basically, they think your project idea is a good one. And again, this is what the portal will look like, and you're attaching your letters of support from your local employers and industry groups in this section. To summarise for this criteria, you're being asked how your project fits into the local community, what the community benefit is, the community need, the link between your learner group and the skills shortage and labour needs of your community. So when you're writing, you need to address who needs work, what industry suits them, what are the labour shortages in your community? Do your employers know your organisation? Do they support your project? And if possible, would they employ your participants? So you absolutely don't need letters from employers saying, yes, we will give 5 people a job at the end of this program. But it's really about supporting the principle of the idea, saying that, yes, if we're in the position to be employing people, these are the kinds of people we would need. And you need to make a case for how the project links with other local initiatives. So it really shows that you understand your community well. Okay, criteria 3. Strategies to assist participants. And this is where you're working really closely with your RTO and you're going to be offering different assistance to your RTO. Essentially, Skilling Queenslanders for Work really is an initiative targeting those who've had some barriers to gaining employment. So obviously there's many reasons that some will struggle to find work, and this criteria shows that you understand those barriers specific to the group that you're targeting and that you have plans for how you're going to support them. Think about organisations or services in your community who would assist you to support participants and whether or not you need to find out more about their specific challenges. Childcare, language, transport to and from the location of the training, cultural safety, they're just some of the things to think about here. And it's important to note that the RTO who will be delivering the training, their plan for assisting learners is different to your plan for supporting learners. So gaining a qualification is just one part of Skilling Queenslanders for Work. The other part is actually gaining the employment. And getting the employment is actually very different to just gaining the qualification. So the wraparound support that your organisation provides and those who you partner with really takes the participants to the next level, really. And the things that you're going to be providing to them as far as support goes is going to be quite different to the training support that the RTO provides. And I'm sure, given you work in with the sector already, you have things that your organisation does really well as far as supporting your cohort. So what processes and strategies are you going to be using to assist participants? That's what you're looking at here. And you will attach a sample template of a training and support plan. And that plan must include strategies to address barriers to training and employment. So you can see here that in your attachments, you can go into quite a bit of detail. So in the written response to the assessment criteria, you're being really specific and really targeted about the word count that what you're going to be putting into that box, because you're remembering that the detail, like for example the training and support plan, you're attaching that as an attachment. So you can go into, so be really careful. Don't waste your character count in this criteria box going over too much information that's already included in the attachments. Your key is writing a really succinct and clear summary in these criteria responses. And then the funder, the assessor, will be having a look at your attachments to get more detail. So what's really being asked here is how are you going to support participants to overcome their barriers? And you need to address that you understand the people that you're working with and what their barriers are, that you can articulate how you're going to support participants to overcome those barriers, that the learning needs and goals are appropriate to the cohort, and the job placement and post-placement support and transition to employment, that you've got some strategy around that. And here's the Skilling Queenslanders for Work tip. Find appropriate training strategies. Not only training strategies, but support strategies to just assist them with the day-to-day rhythm of turning up for learning, turning up for work. There might be quite a few things that you need to think about. If your cohort has young children, the day and time of the day might make a difference. Accessibility, what kind of transport options there are, how people are going to get there. Language barriers, what kind of learning and assessment resources they might need. Resume support and interview training. That's something that a lot of organisations offer as part of their strategies to assist participants. There's lots of things here to think about. And really not many limitations on what you can offer as far as support goes. Quite a few of the successful Skilling Queenslanders for Work projects we see offer things like driving lessons for learner drivers, because the real barrier for them maintaining employment is actually being able to, they can't drive. So helping them get that so they can stay in their employment. Assisting them with navigating public transport because it's not something they've done before. All of those kinds of things. There really is such a broad range of support you're able to offer. This is why Skilling Queenslanders work is quite a exciting opportunity, really, because there's a lot you can do. Okay, so for criteria 4, we're looking at outcomes, and this is where your evaluation comes into play. You can see there's no mandatory documentation required for this one. You don't need to be attaching anything, but you do need to describe how you think you're going to be getting your outcomes. So justifying the outcomes you're proposing. How will the proposed qualifications or job preparation training help participants gain employment? Describe the outcomes you believe you will be getting with your program, and any details of past performance is really helpful here. Obviously, everyone has to start somewhere, so not all organisations putting in a funding application have evidence to support this, but any evidence you have that's even similar as far as how you provide support to your cohort or other experience your organisation might have in any kind of learning, training, etc. Really good to include that in here. Now, the as far as outcomes go, it can sometimes be tricky to know what outcomes would be reasonable to your funder. And in Skilling Queenslanders for Work, there are program guidelines for every one of the 8 programs in the funding round. So I have taken a screenshot of the funding guidelines for community work skills. And in all of the guidelines, you'll see that there is a section which says what outcomes are expected, which is very handy because we don't have to guess what we think would be successful in the eyes of the funder. We can see here that for this program specifically, for work skills, the completion outcome should be 65% of participants gaining qualification or statement of attainment, and that the employment outcome should be 55% of participants. So that gives you a really good idea of what the funding would view as successful. So you can have a think about your idea, whether or not you think that's reasonable for what you're putting forward, whether or not you would be able to meet that expectation. It's a really good thing to have a look at. And those guidelines for funding are available for all of the programs. You can have a look at what success looks like. So really in this section, it's asking you, ultimately, how are you going to help your participants get a job? Because that's what Skilling Queenslanders for Work is really about. You need to outline the pathway you're going to provide and outline any past outcomes you've had doing similar work. Now, here's a tip from one of the Work Advisory Committee members. Applicants need to show their connections to community and to local employers and explain how they will move people to employment. Because at the end of the day, that's really what Skilling Queenslanders is about. It's this two-pronged success, and one is about attaining qualifications and learning, and the other is about securing employment. And a quick note about the Work Advisory Committee members. If you're not familiar with how Skilling Queenslanders for Work applications are assessed, they are quite regionally based, which means that after capacity to manage has been assessed by DESBIT, the applications actually move to regional work advisory committees. There's one in every DESBIT region. They're made up of different industry representatives and employers and community organisations. And they actually make recommendations to DESBIT about what projects in their local community they think will work well. So there's quite a lot of local knowledge, expertise that goes into assessing the applications. So I think that's quite comforting to know when you're putting together an application for your community, which you obviously know well, that the people looking at your application and making recommendations regarding your application are also people who know your community well. So they'll be well placed to know what might work. Now, the final criteria is cost and value for money. So what will it cost? And what will be provided in kind? And will it be cost effective? Now, it's important to note here that DESBIT cost and value for money is not just about the price. So DESBIT does have some nominal benchmarks for costs, and any funder will have nominal benchmarks for costs. Some funding comes with really specific money that's available. For something like Skilling Queenslanders for work, because projects are so varied and target completely different cohorts or numbers in a cohort or project, there isn't a set amount that's available for you. You have to put forward a budget and say what you're able to deliver for the amount of money you're asking for. So best value does not mean the cheapest in the eyes of the funder, especially not in this case anyway. You do, however, have to address how you came up with the costs. So you need to justify how these costs will help participants overcome any barriers and get a job. You also need to be realistic about the number of participants you wish to assist against available program budgets. So the department will look at outcomes achieved on previous SKU projects as a benchmark for that. If SKU's been around for a while now, so they've seen lots of different projects come and go. So they do have a rough idea about what they think is achievable for particular amounts of money. Now, an important thing to consider when you're putting together your financials is how much in-kind contribution you and any partners will be making, and what that in-kind contribution actually entails. So remember to think about what your organisation is providing and articulate any of that in-kind support. Examples include a training room, learning resources. You might be partnering with an organisation that's going to provide lunch for the learners. You might be using your organisational minibus to pick up learners and bring them to the training location. Anything like that. Think about absolutely every aspect of the program you're delivering and what you're paying for and what you're providing as in-kind support, and your partners as well. Put the rationale in about how you came to your cost estimates, and what are the value adds. So an example of a value add might be providing resume writing skills, or doing some interview training, or getting participants ready for interviews. And don't forget to include current letters from the other organisations providing in-kind support on their letterhead. So really formalising those partnerships is crucial right at the beginning of this process. So you can be clear on what other organisations will be providing. So in summary, you're explaining how your project meets the program objectives and improves the situation for participants. You're demonstrating how it delivers specific benefits to your community. Make it clear to see why your organisation is best placed to deliver the project in this community and to this group of people. And in summary, explain why the committee should choose your organisation and your project and not another organisation. Here are some of the common pitfalls that we've heard from DESBIT. The first pitfall, and probably the most important, is not addressing the assessment criteria. So the assessment criteria in any funding application, they're obviously the key things your application is going to be assessed against. So if you're not explicitly addressing each area and providing evidence to back it up, the assessors can't get a good understanding of your project and whether or not it's going to meet their objectives. And again, making sure you're giving equal weighting to your assessment criteria, because the way that they're scoring or assessing your application, you're really going to your response is really going to fall over a bit in the scoring side of things if you've written lots and lots of words about one element in particular and then really neglected the others. So again, going back to that structure, looking at your word count and how much you're allocating to each element of the assessment criteria. On a similar note, it's really important to provide clear and accurate project summaries. If the assessors can't quickly glean from your project summary what your project is about, your application is really not going to stand out. Don't make the reader do the work. The next pitfall is not demonstrating local knowledge and understanding of your cohort. So local community ownership is a cornerstone of the SKU program. It's really important that you address this throughout your application. You must demonstrate that you understand your target cohort and their barriers to success, and provide the evidence that you have the experience and capacity to support them, and provide specialist assistance. Now, you might think that cutting and pasting text from a previous application will save you time, but there's often more effort involved in editing to make it relevant than if you had started from scratch. And just be wary of cutting and pasting without targeting the information to the current project or funding application, especially if you're in a rush. I've seen this happen before where it's really obvious that information has been cut and paste because it has old dates in it, or references to last year, or things like that. So sometimes it's more trouble than it's worth cutting and pasting, although obviously previous applications are really good to reference to get ideas from, so you're not having to rewrite lots of things that are consistent across funding applications. Now, our next step here is providing supporting evidence, really important. So as you're crafting your responses to the assessment criteria, you need to be thinking about what evidence you can provide to support your application. And again, as we were going through this the assessment criteria, in the right-hand column of that document is those mandatory pieces of evidence that you will need to attach in the portal if you're applying for Skilling Queenslanders for work. And this is where it pays to have built up your grants reference library that we talked about right at the beginning, because lots of the information will be there and ready to go. You should also map out what other documents the grant application requires, the letters of support from the community, local council or business, partnership agreements, project budget, and so on. And that way you can make sure you're gathering enough evidence to include in your application. Though you might gather your evidence as one of your final steps, ensure that you will have the evidence you need to make your submission. So spending lots of time writing and then thinking, oh, I'm just going to get all of those attachments together in the last day, probably won't work out very well for you. So as you go along, actually ensuring that you have those pieces of evidence is really important. Now, here's a SKU tip. Make sure you provide evidence from local employers that they support your project, like I've said before, not just support for your organisation. You need to show a link between training and skills development and local employment outcomes. Make sure they're relevant to the training in your proposal, that they demonstrate industry demand for the qualifications you've identified, and that they link to employment opportunities in your region, and that they're current. Again, keeping COVID in mind, things like travel aren't really happening. So applications you put forward previously targeting specific industries might not be as current as they were previously. It might not mean that you have to completely change the idea of things that you've put forward previously, but you might need to change your numbers, or you might need to change what the KPIs really look like for your program. In a town where they rely heavily on tourism and they're not now getting much travel, do you really need 15 new baristas? So having a think about that. And again, the letters from employers and industry don't need to be a commitment that they will give your participants jobs. It just needs to show that they support what you're trying to deliver, and that the skills your participants are gaining are in demand in your local area, and that they would be likely to employ someone with those skills. Now, make sure you're not providing letters of support that are 3 years old. They really should be no older than 6 months. So if you've worked with organisations before or businesses before and you need to refresh those letters of support, please do so before you submit them. They really need to be within the last 6 months. A solid budget. So be really realistic when you're setting your budget, and you want to be competitive, but you also need to ensure that you've thought through all of the costs. You don't want to be cut short when you're delivering the project. So if your costs are in the higher side, make sure you explain why in your application. For example, if you're delivering in a remote area, you need to outline that things might cost more. Ensure that you include all of your in-kind support in your application, whether it's financial or otherwise. Make sure you read the guidelines to see what costs are allowed in the funding. As I said earlier, the scope is pretty broad for Skilling Queenslanders for work, but still, obviously, there's going to be some things that aren't able to be covered. So make sure you read those guidelines, and for any funding that you're applying for. Think about how you're going to acquit your grant and how you're going to demonstrate the amount of time and effort that you budgeted for in kind, that it's actually being contributed. So have a bit of think about what it looks like on the other end when you're actually needing to submit your final acquittal and report. Don't forget, you need 2 years of audited financial statements for this funding application if you're submitting for Skilling Queenslanders for work. Now, step 7, we're getting really close to the end. Step 7 is proofreading, making sure your attachments are there, and triple checking. And I have a few tips now for this part of the process. Okay, proofreading and editing tips. Firstly, make it clear. Your response should be clearly written. And by this, I mean use simple and direct language using a predominantly active voice. Writing clearly requires clarity of thought, which is why it's so important to have planned out your approach before you write. Keep the language simple. You don't need to be using fancy words. Avoid jargon, euphemisms, or cliches. Lose the adverbs and any words that don't add value, such as we had in the writing example before, very significantly, losing words like that. Words like really, basically, actually. It's really important, particularly when you have a word count. Make it concise. So use your best examples. Use acronyms and abbreviations wisely. Most of you probably know the trick where you will write out the name of a program and organization in full first, and then you can put it in brackets afterwards and then use the acronym or the shortened name in the brackets for the rest of your writing so that the reader knows what you mean. Make sure you get to the point. Don't waffle on. Avoid irrelevant examples. Even if they're good examples of good work, if they don't make a case for supporting the project idea that you're putting forward right at the moment, they're probably not a good thing to be including because you're wasting word count on examples that don't support your project idea. When you fail to get to the point, you're really asking the reader to do all the work to construct meaning from your text. So it's really a principle of good writing, and particularly good tender writing, to make sure the reader does as little as possible. So everything should be geared towards making things easy and clear when they're reading through. Make it comprehensive. So make sure you answer all of the questions, like we've mentioned before, giving equal weighting to all parts of the assessment criteria, addressing all of the elements. Avoid making any unsubstantiated claims and failing to provide evidence or example. Sometimes you'll see organisations make quite generalised claims, such as XYZ is an industry leader in the field. If you're making claims like that, the onus is on you to provide evidence. So ensure that what you're saying, you can actually provide some kind of benchmarking data for. If you don't have any data to evidence it, don't say it. Be really specific in your claim so that you can provide the evidence. So for example, instead you could say XYZ organisation has consistently achieved 80% placement rates over the last 5 years of delivering this program, as shown in our performance data attached. Make it persuasive. So here you're obviously using examples to persuade your reader that what you're saying is correct, that they can believe what you're saying. You can also help to use the same type of language as the funder. So we talk about, in the sector, we talk about buzzwords. If there's particular things that the funder is obviously keen on in all of their documentation, make sure you're reflecting that in your language. You're connecting with them. So if they talk a lot about partnership, if they talk a lot about collaboration, make sure you're reflecting that in your writing. And keep it on point. Your answer could be everything we've just talked about, but if your points are not relevant to your tender opportunity, it won't help. So being relevant is a critical feature of your good response. Make sure your points link to the requirements of the particular tender or grant and focus on the benefits you're offering to the funder. You rarely need words like perhaps, maybe, try, attempt, possible. They creep in when we're not sure and we're not feeling confident about the statement we're making. So make sure you're not including those words in any of your writing, because you'll come across as not quite confident about what you're saying. As you can see here, a way to keep things succinct, instead of saying perhaps you could try to reduce the word count by looking to see if it's possible maybe to attempt to remove indecision, you could say you could reduce words by removing indecision. Same message, far less words. And any of you who were on the webinar yesterday will remember this one. If you're a Star Wars fan, it might help you to remember C3PO. So in those writing tips I just went through, we had 3 C's, a P and an O: clear, concise, comprehensive, persuasive, and on point. So just keep this little guy in your head when you're writing. Now, I can't emphasize enough the benefit of having fresh eyes picking up on errors. Our brains are so clever that once we've written something and our brain knows what we're trying to say, we will gloss over typos, grammar. We'll gloss over all of those mistakes when we read it. Most of you probably have had the experience where other people have been able to pick up mistakes in your writing. So a fresh set of eyes to read through what you've written before you submit is always a good idea. Another thing you can use for editing is apps such as Grammarly or Hemingway, and Maria has popped links to those in the chat. And again, we will put them in the post event email as well. The Hemingway app is a good example of where you can copy and paste your words, your content, what you've written, into the app and you get immediate feedback. Editing tools like this, they really help you evaluate your text. You can learn from them and improve your writing by getting that constant feedback. But again, strongly recommend you get someone independently to review your application. Someone who hasn't worked on the submission, because anyone who has worked on the submission with you, again, while they might be able to pick up on typos and things like that, because they know what the project is about, their brain, as clever as it is, will start to fill in gaps. So it's really good to be able to get someone to read through your tender application who actually hasn't been part of the conversations about the project, because they can give you really objective feedback about whether or not it makes any sense with it, because they don't have any prior knowledge, just like your assessor doesn't have any prior knowledge. They haven't been at the table, they haven't been discussing this project idea, so their brain won't be filling in any of those gaps. So getting someone who really doesn't have any knowledge of the project, it's a great idea to get them to have a read through. And before we're hitting submit, obviously we're making sure we've got all of your attachments. Now, I think that the Skilling Queenslanders for Work portal doesn't actually let you submit without having attached all the attachments. But in any other circumstance, you might, it might not be using a portal. So again, looking at the checklist that you made right at the beginning, making sure you've got every piece of evidence or attachment there. And a good time to remind you here about ensuring you've got the right attachments, not just attachments, but they're the right ones. So this is where your e-filing and your naming of documents comes into play, making sure the ones that are relevant to this year or this funding application are saved in the right folder, that you're not accidentally attaching things from last year. Just be really careful of things like that. They're simple, really easy to do mistakes that then have quite an effect on your success or not. So make sure you've got the right attachments. And breathe. So once you finish your application, the last stage of the process is to breathe out, to reflect, ask for feedback, and repeat the process. So great idea for any submission that you make for after they've kind of released who's successful and who's not, is to ask them for some feedback. What would they suggest you work on next? What worked really well in your application, all of those kinds of things. And as I've mentioned previously, the good news is that Skilling Queenslanders for Work is here to stay as a long-term initiative. So there's absolutely opportunity to refine your ideas and projects and apply for the funding again next time.
Yeah, as I said, asking for feedback is a really good opportunity. It's like when you don't get a job and you can ask your interviewers for feedback for you to keep in mind for next time. Now, this link we will include in the post-event email, but it's great for, especially for not-for-profit organisations, questions to ask when reading your funding agreement if you are successful. Some really good things just to keep in mind before you sign on the dotted line. Okay, any questions about submitting that application? Okay, Belinda's asked about seeing examples of successful projects on the department's website. I believe there are. Where there are some great examples of successful projects is the introduction to Skilling Queenslanders work webinar that we did run, and we will be putting a recording up on the website, and we do have slides for that. So Belinda, anyone who would like to see those slides, which actually include quite a few examples, perhaps you can put your email in the chat. You can send it to me directly, or you can send it to Maria directly. She's got the QCOS name. We can send you the slides for that if you didn't participate in the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work webinar. Now, on the department website, there's actually a map which shows all of the different projects happening across Queensland. Thanks, Lorraine. Oh, yes, you did go to the first webinar. Okay, great. Look, I don't know of more examples than that. I'm not sure whether or not they have made them available on the website. I know that you can actually see a map of Queensland and the different projects, and the contact details for the organisations are there. Okay, we've got quite a few people interested in gaining those case studies, so that's fine. Maria, would you mind just taking a note of those, and we'll send the slides to everyone who's interested afterwards, because you're right. I think sometimes, I mean, the great thing about SKU is that the what you can do is really broad, which is exciting. But the challenge I find when the parameters are broad is that sometimes you can really actually get a little bit overwhelmed with the possibilities, and you get a little bit stuck with your creativity. So it's great, I think, to be able to see what other organizations have done and what their outcomes have been, because it can show you what really leads to success. Now, before we go, I want to quickly cover off on our Human Rights Act and the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations. There's only a couple of slides in this little part. It's not too comprehensive. Really, this is applicable to you because if you're successful in obtaining grants or money from the Queensland Government, you have obligations around these two documents. So even if you're not obtaining SKU funding, it's a really good idea to be across these anyway. So just a few comments to make about these. So for those of you who may not be aware, the Human Rights Act came into play early last year, 1st of January 2020, and it lists 23 human rights. Now, just for a bit of context, modern human rights law has evolved since the late 1940s, and really it was a response to the atrocities of World War II, when the world said, we can't have these things ever happen again. And so Australia is part of the existing, has signed most of the existing international human rights treaties, but it's only when those rights are incorporated into domestic legislation that they can really properly be protected. So Queensland was the third state or territory to introduce human rights legislation. The first was the ACT in 2004, and Victoria followed suit in 2006. So you can see the objectives or goals of the Act listed on the slide. And building a culture of human rights is a long-term goal. It's not something that will happen overnight. And it's our sector's ownership and use of the Act that will be a critical ingredient for the development of a human rights culture across government and across the human services sector. So the bit that's really relevant for you is how the Human Rights Act applies to public entities. Now, a public entity is an organisation or body performing a public function in and for Queensland. There's two types of public entities. There's core public entities and functional public entities. Now, core public entities are government entities. They're their government agencies and departments like the Department of Employment, Small Business and Training and their employees, public service employees, the Queensland Police Service and other emergency services, state government ministers, public schools, public health services, including hospitals, and local government councillors and council employees. Now, functional public entities are only considered public entities when they're performing a function or of a public nature on behalf of the state. So, community organisations fall into this category when we're delivering services on behalf of the Queensland Government. So at these times, you're really seen as an extension of government. And this is why the Human Rights Act applies to you if you're delivering anything with government funds. Now, if you think about things from the perspective of participants that you support with multiple and complex needs, which many of them have, they've got barriers to employment, there's reasons for that. These are people for whom the systems they move within and the agencies who make decisions on their behalf affect them and their livelihoods and their welfare all of the time. Now, you might be in a position where you've never really had to think about your human rights before, but some of the cohorts that we will be targeting through Skilling Queenslanders for Work, this is a reality for them. It's really important to understand how the human rights might affect your work. It's important to understand that only individuals have human rights. Organisations do not have human rights. Human rights are about individuals. And the rights that might seem more applicable for the work that you're doing are, for example, number 17, protection from torture, cruel or inhumane or degrading treatment. Section 25, privacy and reputation. Really importantly, section 27 and 28, which is cultural rights specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and section 36, which is a right to education. So these are the kinds of things to keep in mind. I really recommend, if you are feeling like you don't really know enough about this, the Queensland Human Rights Commission, their website, which is up there on the slide, has some great professional development that you can do. So check out the website if you're feeling a little unsure. We're not sharing this information to make you feel worried about all your obligations at all. It's just something to be aware of. And I'm sure that the community sector organisation has been really good at considering human rights over the years. We've got the Human Services Quality Framework now. We have practice principles across quite a few subsectors in the human services sector. So I think we are pretty good at considering these things. Obviously, there's room for us to get even better at that, but this Human Rights Act really enforces it. Now, any questions about the Human Rights Act before I move on to the child safe principles? No? Okay. Now, the child safe principles, many of you will be familiar with the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which uncovered some really shocking abuse of children within institutions in Australia. And the Commission recommended taking action to make organisations across the country safe for children, which I think we can all agree is an excellent thing. The development of the national principles for child safe organisations, or national principles, is a key national reform in response to these recommendations. And these principles have been endorsed by the Commonwealth and all state and territory governments. So the Queensland government have endorsed these principles and have asked us to keep them in mind when we're delivering services. They provide a nationally consistent approach to embedding child safe cultures within organisations that engage with children. Now, you might think this doesn't really apply to us with SKU. However, if the cohort you're targeting is youth and they are children, or you are targeting a cohort for whom you will be engaging with their children and their families, because you might be offering some childcare assistance, creche, that kind of thing, or you're even delivering qualifications that require these participants to be familiar with child safe principles. You can see now, with just a few of that brief explanation, that really your familiarity with these principles is crucial. A child safe organisation consciously and systematically creates an environment where children's safety and well-being is the centre of thought, values and actions. It places emphasis on genuine engagement with and valuing of children. It creates conditions that reduce the likelihood of harm to children and young people and creates conditions that increase the likelihood of identifying harm. It responds to concerns, disclosures, allegations or suspicions. And you may have seen that from the 1st of July, legislation was passed making it mandatory for any adult to report child sexual offences. Okay, that's actually all I've got for that. Is there any questions about the child safe principles? Maria will have shared in the chat the document where you can get, it's far more comprehensive than what I've covered here, both for the Human Rights Act and for the Child Safe Principles. So recommend checking them out. Even if you're not applying for SKU, these things are relevant to you as organisations. Okay, thanks, Maria. Okay, I think just about everyone would like to receive the case study. So we'll get those out to you, that's fine. Now, I would love to know what you liked about the workshop, any feedback you have about the workshop. Maria's going to pop a poll up onto the screen, but I would love to hear from you to see what you liked. And of course, if you're applying for the funding, good luck. I hope it's successful. We'll be running these workshops again early next year, as I mentioned before. So if you would like to refresh the information that you received today, you're very welcome to attend again. And we also have the Introduction to Skilling Queenslanders for Work webinars, which detail the actual ins and outs of Skilling Queenslanders for Work itself rather than the tender writing. And we have a tips and tricks webinar that some of you attended yesterday. I hope the information today was really extended on what was shared yesterday. Yesterday was quite brief, but today's was a little more comprehensive. So I really hope that this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions, please let us know, but let us know how you found the workshop itself using the poll or the chat. And we'll get that post-event email out to you, so you'll have all of the resources at your fingertips.